Good morning. I'm pleased to be here again to talk about the Japanese-American experience in the military. I'm the daughter of a Korean War veteran, the cousin of a highly decorated Vietnam veteran, and I myself am a United States Navy retiree. There was no expectation of military service in my family, but those who influenced me early in my life as an American living and growing up overseas were U.S. service members, ranging from the United States Marine Security Guard Detachment at the United States Embassy in Islamabad to the military attaches, to our ambassador, retired Brigadier General Byrode, and the famed Brigadier General Chuck Yeager, who, as you may recall, was the first pilot to break the sound barrier. I was determined to be a U.S. Marine. However, I got into medical school, and when I went to the recruiting table, the Marine recruiter pointed me over to the Navy table and told me that I'd have to join the Navy, and the rest is history. I didn't know at the time that I joined the Navy that there was a huge number of people the successes of whom in the segregated units, fighting for freedoms that their families didn't enjoy. They were the ones who opened the door for me and all Americans to pursue careers that are much less encumbered, if not unencumbered, by prejudice and discrimination that they faced prior to, during, and even after World War II. I'm humbled and honored by my heritage, and I'll continue to strive to be the voice of my grandparents, who were brave and loyal immigrants from Japan, whose voices were silenced by the indignities that they suffered, and during that period of hysteria, prejudice, and suspicion. And I will leverage the success of those who died to make this possible for me to improve the lives of our fellow men, women, and children who continue to face adversity in this country. So July 15th is a day of affirmation. President Truman invited the segregated unit, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and the 100th Infantry Battalion to the nation's capital after the war. In his speech to the nation on July 15th, President Truman affirmed that the soldiers standing before him were in fact loyal Americans, and that putting a country first was the way to win the war and to fight against prejudice, and that they were entitled to share in America's opportunities and to receive equal treatment under the Constitution. And his exact words were, "You have fought not only the enemy abroad, but prejudice at home, and you have won." We always quote that, but what the remainder of it is so important today, and that is to keep up that fight, and we'll continue to win, to make the Republic stand for just what the Constitution says it stands for, the welfare of all the people, all the time. I just want to give you a little background history on the 442nd. The 442nd was created to supplement the 100th Infantry Battalion and to fight in Europe. This was a segregated unit where over 10,000 Japanese Americans from Hawaii volunteered for 4,600 slots. Ultimately, almost 3,000 were selected, and 1,500 additional volunteers came from the relocation camps on the mainland. So these men connected up in Camp Shelby in Mississippi, and their legendary actions and heroism paved the way for us and for future generations of Americans of Japanese descent, and by extension, other Asian immigrants. So while these soldiers in Europe and the military intelligence service in the Pacific returned from war and from the relocation camps, they still continued to face some prejudice. Race was still an issue, and was the concern for economic factors, including things like the fall in property values if Japanese American families were allowed to return to their former neighborhoods. Also, some local and national organizations sought to exclude Japanese Americans from schools, including colleges and universities, and businesses refused to hire them. So in the in the follow-on, the Japanese American Citizens League, which was one of the earliest civil rights organizations, had quietly but relentlessly pursued legal cases to restore the rightful place and the civil liberties for Japanese Americans, and they continue to do so to this day. So why is this relevant today? Well, a lot has changed since the last time I spoke to this group of educators, and of course, even the way that we deliver our lessons in the classroom has changed, but not everything has been positive. And I think we need to take comfort in history to discover and empower our collective resilience. We have to understand that as a society, as a culture, as a nation, as a community, and even as individuals, we have faced challenges before, and someone somewhere has overcome them. Someone who looks like us and even shares our history. So let's look into our toolboxes and repurpose some of those tools to build our communities and our classrooms back up. So today, many communities, like even in my own community in Montgomery County, Maryland, has experienced an uptick in hate speech targeting U.S. citizens that don't look the same as them. Asian Americans have been blamed for the coronavirus pandemic, even though they are neither Chinese nor have even been to China. So hurtful comments that seemed to be suppressed over the last 10 years have come back into the forefront, and these are things like go back to where you came from, or people will say to me, oh, you speak English so well, and or even make the statement that you people, meaning people like me, are taking jobs away from Americans as though I were not an American. And this has been coupled with actual acts of violence that have also been reported. So for many minority communities, including First or Native Americans, none of this is new. But Asians were long touted as the, quote, model minority, and were somewhat shielded. And part of this is because, of course, low visibility and small numbers, as all Asians combined still constitute only about 4.5% of the American population. But this number remains small as a consequence of immigration laws that were enacted as the Chinese and Japanese in particular became more competitive in agriculture and business in the West. So I wanted to mention, of course, that these are some quote-unquote new Americans, or Americans who have recently, been recognized as equal, like women, for example, did not have the right to vote till the 19th Amendment, and African Americans who suffered not only slavery but the aftermath of segregation, and continue to be an extremely diverse population. And of note, Hispanic Americans have not often been in the forefront of discussions such as this, and only recently have been included in the census as white of Hispanic origin. But recall that Mexican Americans were not necessarily Americans, or may have been Mexicans, may have been Americans, but an arbitrary geopolitical line was drawn, and you were Mexican one day and American the next day, and vice versa. So there are some historical markers that we need to take into consideration as well. So here are some of the immigration policies. These are somewhat troubling if you look at them from today's perspective. But of course, the times at which they were enacted, things were different. So the first Japanese Americans came over in 1843. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act prohibited Chinese immigrants from becoming citizens. In 1905, marriage between whites and, quote, Mongolians, meaning anyone that was from, at the time, East Asia, was prohibited. In 1907, what was called the Gentleman's Agreement. So the U.S. agreed not to impose restrictions on immigration from Japan, and that allowed wives and children to come over. It started the phenomenon of picture brides, where you picked a wife or picked a bride out of a spreadsheet or a catalog. And in 1913, California passed that alien land law to, quote, save California from the Japs, unquote. This prohibited Japanese from owning agricultural lands. But by 1913, there were enough native-born Americans of Japanese descent, children in whose names this property was purchased. In 1920, they stopped the picture bride passports, and that shut down immigration from Japan. In 1924, this is a crucial immigration act that barred Asiatic immigrants. So then this targeted specifically the Japanese. So note that 1924 was the last date that Japanese were allowed to immigrate to the United States. Thus, if you do the math, the most recent immigrants had been living and working in the United States for 17 years, which was most likely represented the majority of their adult lives at the time of World War II. So Japan then emerged as a world power and as a threat. In 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Martial law was declared by 1600 or 4 p.m. on December the 7th. By December the 8th, civic leaders, teachers, successful first-generation Japanese Americans, landowners, and even judo instructors were arrested, detained, and considered for deportation. Then this is where my family history becomes a little divergent or kind of interesting. So my paternal grandfather was a teacher and a religious leader in Pahoa, Hawaii, which is a small village and still is a small village on the Big Island of Hawaii. He already had 6 U.S.-born children, and the youngest 2, which included my dad, were still dependents. But because he was a religious leader and a civic leader in the community, he was considered a threat and was scheduled for deportation. When my uncle, my dad's older brother, chose to join the army, and movement of troops took a higher priority, they reversed that decision, and my grandfather was then sent to a prisoner of war camp in Louisiana. Much later, we found out that my grandfather's brother, a Colonel Nakao, served in the Imperial Japanese Army as a combat engineer. So like other families from Japan, the one son may come back to the or may come to the United States for better opportunities or for more opportunities, and others stayed behind. So my great uncle Nakao stayed in Japan and was actually drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army, where he served as a combat engineer. He was later killed on Iwo Jima by the U.S. Marines. And as a member of the Japanese American Veterans Association, I was able to meet with members of the direct lineal descendants of other Japanese families who lost husbands and fathers on Iwo Jima. So I had the privilege to sit at a table with 3 women who remarked that they never knew their fathers, that they were only babies when their fathers were killed in the war. So this brought home to me the similarities of these experiences on both sides of every conflict. So we share the same fears, we share the same hopes, and we share the same losses, and we share the same grief. In February, and exactly on February 19th, 1942, Executive Order 9066 was signed into law. Was signed. And this divided the West into 2 military zones, and one included California and the west coast of the mainland, and the other one included Hawaii. So these were completely different environments, and the military leaders had completely different perspectives. So approximately 1,500 people from Hawaii and 120,000 from California, Oregon, and Washington in the western states were relocated to the War Relocation Authority camps. So we also are known as internment camps. So that was my dad's family's experience. What about my mother's side? So my maternal grandfather was a poultry farmer in Waihawa, Hawaii, which was on Oahu, the main island. He had already converted. The whole family had already converted to Christianity, but yet after the start of the war, you can see here that he was given an alien registration card. This is what they all had to carry around with them, and his number was 273-3363. So my mom tells me the story that she was waiting for a ride to church. They attended the Christian church on the base, and I believe it was Schofield Barracks at the time, because she always talked about Schofield Barracks. And so she was waiting for a ride to church. She saw the planes, Japanese planes, flying very low over her neighborhood, and recognized that the planes and the pilots were not American. So while her family was not displaced, they stayed, they did not go to the camps, everything did change for them as well. This is a picture of an actual letter that my grandfather wrote to my aunt from Camp Livingstone, Louisiana, which was a prisoner of war camp on the continental United States. This letter was sent to my aunt, whose name is Miss Momiji, well, they called her Momiji, Izuno, and you see the address there says Tokyo, Japan. So it took a while to get there, but it did reach her. And note also that all the mail was censored, and that the instructions on the flap of the envelope, "Do not write here," were written in German, Italian, and Japanese. So that gives you an idea of what constituted the prison population in this prisoner of war camp. So actual people that we were fighting against, as well as Americans, were in the same prison. So my grandfather was paroled with no charges filed, but was paroled in March of 1944. And he rejoined family at Camp Jerome. So my dad spent 2 years at Camp Jerome, and a little bit additional time in Tule Lake awaiting transport back to. Much later, in about 1988, the Civil Liberties Public Education Fund was established and was authorized to sponsor research and public education activities so that these sites, for example, could be preserved. So the Camp Jerome Rohrer preservation site is in the old train depot at McGehee, Arkansas. So George Takei, of Star Trek fame, as you might recall, was a young child at that Camp Rohrer, which was right up the street from Camp Jerome. The Arkansas governor at the time was active in the KKK and agreed to accept Japanese American internees as long as they, quote, agreed not to stay in Arkansas. So there's only one family recorded that actually did stay in Arkansas. Everybody else went back to Hawaii or California. The Army Corps of Engineers then drained the swampland to make it arable. So I actually visited this site while I was still on active duty, and this was part of the U.S. Military Academy, which is also known as West Point. They did a civil rights ride, and this was an innovative program to familiarize cadets with civil rights issues by actually traveling to the places where some of these major events took place, so that they could better understand the realities of unequal treatment and make them better leaders. So for the last 20 years of my career, the military was engaged in a lot of diversity programs that were aimed at enhancing the talent pool of service members from different backgrounds, having different experiences, different skills. And I was really proud to be an advisor to the president of the Uniformed Services University, which is America's medical school in Bethesda. And I also advised the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Roughhead, about diversity issues for the last decade of my career. Recent events, however, may seem like they may erode that progress, and I fear that the efficiency, productivity, unit cohesiveness will suffer, and if that suffers, then it might affect also our national security. In Jerome, there's only a smokestack that remains at the site. All the rest you can see in the background has really been farmed. It has returned to agricultural land. They were successful in draining that particular swamp. The town of Jerome actually boasts a population of 36 still today. So during the war, the population was up to about 8,000, a little over 8,000. Camp Rohrer was about 30 miles away. Is also dismantled. They do have some structures remaining which are abandoned, most of which were part of the hospital. But not far away in Little Rock is Central High School. That's the school that gained national attention on September 3rd, 1957, which is well within my lifespan, right? When Governor Orval Faubus mobilized the Arkansas National Guard in an effort not to protect, but to prevent 9 African American students from integrating the high school in Little Rock. So the bottom of this monument in Jerome states that this monument was erected to serve to remind us all of these incidents and inspire us to be more vigilant and more alert in safeguarding of the rights of all Americans, regardless of their race, color, or creed. Now, of interest is that this obelisk or monument is actually made out of granite, like almost everything else in Arkansas in this area was actually carved out of granite, and it is the granite state after all. In 1988, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, and this public law, 383, cited racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a lack of political leadership as the primary causes for the incarceration of Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom in the camps were actually native-born Americans. The provisions of this law included redress of $20,000 and a formal presidential apology to every surviving U.S. citizen or legal resident immigrant of Japanese ancestry that was incarcerated during World War II. It was first introduced to Congress in 1987, but was not signed into law until August of 1988. But it was not until October 1990 that a ceremony was held, and the first 9 elderly Japanese Americans were presented with their redress checks. And at that time, it was accompanied by a formal apology that was signed by President George H.W. Bush, and it basically stated that in enacting a law calling for restitution and offering a sincere apology, your fellow Americans have renewed their commitment to the ideals of freedom, equality, and justice. So, how far have we come? Well, the gentleman on your left is well known. That is Senator Daniel Inouye, a true champion of civil rights. He was a Nisei soldier from Hawaii who lost his arm in battle and was field promoted to second lieutenant, an officer rank during the war, which was unusual. Almost everybody in the segregated units were enlisted, and most of the officers were white. He was later awarded a Medal of Honor and an award that was delayed for nearly 40 years because soldiers from segregated units were not written up for high honors, even when their actions deserved recognition. So he always, my tie to Senator Inouye is that he always wanted to be a surgeon. But when he lost his arm, he settled for becoming a lawyer and a civil rights champion. He spent his entire career fighting for all of us, and not just for himself, just as he did in the war. Of note, he went from being a 4F, unfit to serve, to being a true American hero, and then being selected by his peers in the Senate as President pro tempore of the United States Senate, meaning that he was third in line for the presidency. So he went from being, unfit to serve to being third in line for the presidency. So in the middle is kind of the legacy of the 442nd, right? So on the far right of the middle picture is General Eric Shinseki. General Shinseki reached the rank of 4-star general in the United States Army. He was born in Kauai, Hawaii, and went on to serve over 34 years in the United States Army, achieving the rank of full general. On the left is Mr. David Iwata, who served in the United States Air Force and was an advisor to several presidents, and now continues to serve in the county of Los Angeles. Next to him is Rear Admiral David Boone, who is a retired Navy civil engineer. Of course, next to General Shinseki is me. I'm a captain, Navy Medical Corps officer. And in the middle is our JAG Corps officer from Hilo, the same town that I'm from, and from Hilo, Hawaii. And she's now a commander in the Navy Reserve JAG Corps, and she is also a State Department, a United States State Department official. So on the far right is the highest ranking Japanese American today, General Paul Nakasone, who is the head of the U.S. Cyber Command and the National Security Agency in Fort Meade. So I think we've come pretty far from the time when we were considered to be as U.S. citizens, but because of our ancestry, we're considered unfit to serve. We've come a long ways, and there's still a ways to go. I reflect now on these great opportunities that I had to serve this country, but I can't help to remember, and it really hit home to me in the last few years of service, as we were promoting and becoming more open about the way that diversity enhances our mission. And I had no idea that all these men, what they endured in the 442nd and the 100th Regiment, the 100 Infantry Battalion, but they made these sacrifices for their families, for the freedoms that their families didn't have at the time. But they also did it for this country, is to prove their loyalty. And there hasn't really been another group that has had to do this whole-scale effort in war to prove their loyalty to the United States. And these men did do that. So, I mean, I view it kind of as as a call to action. I need to, and I need to preserve their legacy, and I also need to be somebody that they can be proud of. And so those were kind of I took that on as the challenge, and they were singularly focused on securing, preserving the freedoms that their families didn't have at that time, and they continued to do so after the war, so that to pave the way for people like me. And now I feel like it's my obligation to continue to pave the way for those that come behind me, regardless of whether what background that they come from, and give them the opportunities that certainly I had and that I enjoyed.